All right, folks, something a bit different on the conspiracy cabal today. Going back to our normal roles, I'm playing journalist. Nick is my interview subject. And I'm going to ask him about something we never want to talk about again, the COVID-19 pandemic and all the conspiracy theories that have sprung from it. Nick, welcome to my show.
I love it, Rich. I think, if I was attached to any sort of physiologic monitoring device, you'd see that my hands were getting a little bit sweaty and my heart rate was going up. So we'd better cue the music, Ed.
The theory that the COVID pandemic was caused by a leak from a Chinese government-controlled lab was largely dismissed by mainstream scientists at the start of the pandemic. This week, the FBI director, for the first time publicly, gave the agency's official position.
The FBI has for quite some time now assessed that the origins of the pandemic are most likely a potential lab incident in Wuhan.
Well, Nick, thank you for being here. And for listeners, we have not shared anything on this. This is totally, it's actually pretty, it's unscripted. So Nick doesn't know what I'm going to ask him. I don't know what I'm going to ask him. Let's start at the start, mate. Tell me about what you were doing in your professional capacity when you first heard that something bad was on the way.
Listeners will probably, some of them will remember that I was one of Brendan Murphy's deputies, so a Deputy Chief Medical Officer for Australia during the first 6 months of the COVID pandemic, and then was involved in the communications, the vaccine rollout after that. So, look, it's an interesting story to start with. I mean, I live in Canberra, still live there with my family, and we were blanketed in the East Coast bushfires in Australia around about January. So we were not in any way focused on what was going on in Wuhan in China. And I think we were at some point climate refugees where we just had to get out of Canberra. Like, the air quality was awful. I live on a street that's about, say, 100 metres from one end to the other, and you just could not see from one end to the other. That's how thick the smoke was. And so, it was everywhere. It was getting into the house, getting into our lungs. So we got out. So the first time I heard about it was actually we had got out. We'd gone to Sydney. I was doing a scientific project with some other researchers on the effect of bushfire smoke on asthmatics. And I called Professor Paul Kelly for some advice because he's an epidemiologist. It must have been about January the 18th, 2020. And he said, what do you think about this new pneumonia coming out of Wuhan? And I just went, what pneumonia? I had no idea. And I think, like a lot of Australians on the East Coast, our eyes were on the bushfire. We weren't thinking about it.
Yeah, I remember seeing it. I was at the Age newspaper then and remember reading little stories that were towards the back of the news section that increasingly came towards the front, and for weeks kind of, putting it down to, this is a bit overblown, this is a doomsday scenario, this is a conspiracy, Then it wasn't. So in your role as Deputy Chief Medical Officer of Australia, when did the government and when did you guys in those positions realise this was going to be really serious?
Yes, I should just give a little bit of context because I've actually done a piece of research over the past 3 years. It's a PhD and it's just about ready to submit. So it's on the closure of the international borders. So I wasn't actually involved with that decision. That decision happened on March the 19th, 2020, and I'd only just started with the government then. So I've done the research on the lead up to that. I was still an infectious disease doctor at Canberra Hospital during that period of time. And, really I think it starts to escalate around the 21st of January. You start getting reports out that are – initially China denies human-to-human transmission, right? That's an important thing because as soon as you've got human-to-human transmission and healthcare workers getting sick and unwell, then you've got a major problem on your hand with a novel virus. It was deny, and then suddenly it became clear because there were cases popping up in Thailand. There was a big modelling report that showed, well, if you had one case in Thailand, you must actually be, up around a few thousand cases in Wuhan, and they were only saying 40 cases or something. When people started realising that inaccurate information, we can talk about why it was inaccurate or otherwise, coming out of China, when that accuracy was questioned, then the Australian government and its medical advisors started paying pretty close attention to it. And in fact, the key thing happens on January the 21st when we list the novel coronavirus as a listed human disease, which basically means Australia was saying, well, we think this might be a pandemic. Now, at the time, the World Health Organization had a similar meeting and they said, no, we don't think it's going to become a pandemic. So we were one of the first movers in saying we think this is going to go.
Was there a betting market?
Not amongst the chief health officers, if that's what you mean.
So let's get to China. I'll get to the theories around how the disease actually got out in a minute. But why do you think there was the initial downplaying that this was already transmitting human to human?
There's a lot of theories about this, and we are the conspiracy cabal, so we should acknowledge that a lot of people think that this was going on before December 31st. So there was a press release, I think, locally on December 30th in China. It gets picked up by the World Health Organization country office, and that is the official start of COVID-19. Claims from the United States, from credible scientists, that there was so much circulation or so much antibody being detected in people that it must have predated that this thing was starting to go around the world already. Don't know the answer to that. The reason for the Chinese government being sort of reticent, I think there is a sort of credible political explanation for that, which is like if you're in an authoritarian government, if you're like whether it's communist China or communist Russia in the 20th century or whatever, and actually if you watch the miniseries on Chernobyl, it's a really good example of this. If you screw up, your number one aim is to cover your ass because you know that if you don't, like the consequences for you are literally existential. So in those sort of authoritarian political structures, there's no openness or transparency or desire to come clean. So I think there's good political reasons why that was being contained within Wuhan and not a lot of information was coming out, and the Chinese government wasn't particularly receptive to the World Health Organization. There's all sorts of issues around that as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I actually had a coffee a while ago with a guy who wanted to know if I wanted to work on a documentary with him, and he claimed to have had a conversation with a man connected to the CIA. This is perfect for conspiracy cabal, who warned him 18 months before. So this is going back into 2018, that the CIA knew there was going to be a pandemic and there was going to be a virus. And now it didn't go any further than that, coffee, and I never met this so-called person or whatever, but, perfect. It invites speculation when you've got something of this consequence happening. I guess the biggest theory or the competing theories is the evolution of the virus. Does it come from bats? Is it a zoonotic disease passed into humans, or was there a lab leak?
Okay, so I'm going to preface this by saying that everything that I'm doing now is sort of speculating, best informed evidence, thinking about things logically. I have not been, proximate or privy to those sort of discussions. It is possible that people within the Australian government were proximate or privy to those. Is that yet to come out? Was there discussions? There were certainly Australian virologists going into Wuhan as part of the World Health Organization team, eventually corroborated the story that this was from the Hunan wet market. And you remember that poor animal that was vilified, the pangolin. It was supposed to be, someone had supposedly eaten a pangolin and everybody got sick. And then the competing theory was, well, it just so happens that the Wuhan Institute of Virology is down the road and we know that they've been doing gain-of-function research. This has been a huge thing.
What is gain-of-function research? Can you explain that?
I can. The objective is that we know that viruses to which humans are non-immune can be devastating in a pandemic sort of sense. We've known that in the 20th century with the Spanish flu. And by experimenting with the viruses to make them more transmissible, more lethal, change them in various ways at a subcellular level, well, at a level of the virus's DNA or RNA, then you can then make vaccines against them or work out how to treat them or something like that. So that's gain of function research. But obviously the problem is if you're sitting there creating a virus that's more transmissible and more lethal and to which we're not immune, if that escapes through a lab leak, which is the other theory, then the world's population is in deep trouble.
We've got a bioweapon.
You got a bioweapon. And I mean, I think, all the exercises that I used to go to, I've had a career in disaster management throughout the 2010s. I went to a lot of pandemic preparedness things at universities. Lab leak was one of the things that was sort of openly discussed as a possibility. There's been a huge amount of controversy about this. Congressional testimonies from people, Anthony Fauci is a name that, raises a lot of concerns amongst people. For an infectious disease physician, he was always one of the heroes of infectious diseases with his name on all of the textbooks. For people with concerns about the pandemic and lab leak, he's an absolute villain who was said to have funded the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Again, I'm not suggesting any form of wrongdoing on Anthony Fauci's part, but simply stating that that's how he's viewed. The guy, I can walk down a Melbourne street, the most locked down city in the world, and feel pretty confident that someone's not going to come and have a go at me because I was the face of vaccines or whatever. But I suspect Fauci's, needs to walk around with some close personal protection in the US.
So on the way in today, Nick, out the front of the building here at the studio, you had half like a halloumi wrap going on. Why only eat half?
It was delicious, mate. And halloumi and mushroom, to be honest, and that's for those of you that don't live in Abbotsford in Melbourne, that's like bacon and eggs. It was really good. But if you eat half of something and wait for 10 minutes, then your satiety reflex kicks in and you don't want any more. And that just gives your body a little bit of a chance to digest without me going all sort of, heavy belly, can't do a podcast sort of vibe. So I reckon that's a great health message.
Maybe I should have been going to wholelife.com.au. Whole Life are our sponsors of Season 1 on Conspiracy Cabal. And mate, they have got an enormous range in online and physical retail stores.
Good health, mate. It's not a conspiracy, that's for sure.
It's not. And for listeners of this podcast, there's a special deal for you. If you use the code CABAL10 at checkout, you're going to get $10 off your first online order when you spend $50 or more on their range of over 6,000 pharmacy and lifestyle essentials.
And if that wasn't enough, mate, you'll also get free shipping if you order over $69 worth of those products Australia-wide. And terms and conditions do apply. I suppose the other thing, which is it is compelling, if we're to give some credence to the lab leak theory, then most of the other viruses that we see have they have little incursions into the human population, yeah? They're like a militia that's kind of causing mischief now and again, and they're not big enough to cause an army. But eventually a series of mutations happen and then it's bad enough to cause a pandemic. Okay, that's consistent with the behaviour of viruses for the most part that we understand. So why then does something turn up that we've never seen before that does an immediate species jump and can turn into a pandemic that all the entire world's population is infected by? I think that's we talk a lot on Conspiracy Cabal about logic and trying to explain things and where smoking guns are.
You've got two competing theories, two possible explanations, and there are pluses and minuses in terms of the credibility of each theory. I don't think anyone could conclusively say that it was definitely from the wet market nor definitely from the lab leak, but people are evaluating the circumstances and then coming to a position of what they think is most likely.
If you were a government where this had supposedly happened, let's assume that it was a lab leak, and you had the means of a government like China, so you were a global superpower, would it not be in your interests to promote a certain theory that absolved you from guilt from this thing that ended up shutting down the entire world? That's a question that most people have an instinctive gut reaction to. I don't think we know whether that happened or not. We know that the Australian government wanted to call for an inquiry at the World Health Assembly in 2020. The world starts to split, yeah. People start to lose faith in the World Health Organization because there is no inquiry. That they seem to have gone along with China's explanation that there were scientists that were questioning it, not in a couple of months' time, but at the time, saying this was potentially a lab leak. And then suddenly everybody goes, no, wet market. And I think that's what.
Why does everyone fall into line?
We all fell into line.
Why? How does that happen?
I'm not sure. We sort of buy this as an argument and we sort of move on. It almost becomes a secondary consideration, at least for if your objective is, okay, now we've got to understand what this is, who it's going to affect, how we're going to protect as many people as Australians as possible, then the question of where it comes from, you just you put it aside for one moment and you leave it there. You don't go back.
But the population's always thinking about, we're always looking for who's to blame or how did this happen?
Yeah.
And to not answer that question, I get there's competing, obviously you're worried about protecting people and preventing transmission and obviously death. But I know, like as a journalist working here at the time in Victoria, we had the hotel quarantine thing. Now and I don't think the Victorian government ever adequately explained or has got a million questions about how they managed COVID here, which we may or may not get to. But for the journalists, see, this is what we were interested in, because obviously our job's not to do health policy and stuff like that, but we wanted to explain to the public how this outbreak happened. So we actually didn't, we investigate, we look to the point of origin to determine how this happened to answer that question.
True, but no one did.
Well,
it's as much of a question to.
But we were able to establish how it got there through the security. How it broke out from security guards.
From hotel. Sorry, I thought we were talking about lab leaks.
No, lab leak. I mean, other journalists. There's been some really, really strong reporting in Australia and elsewhere around the lab leak theory, which I think holds a lot of validity. And yeah, the absence of a proper, rigorous inquiry to this point of how this started astounds me. Given the amount of deaths, the amount of money, the upheaval, it's astonishing. And the fact that Australia has not publicly pushed harder for that.
Yeah, well, I think it's become a geopolitical issue. Like if you start to look at what came out in sort of 2023, 2024, you started to have US DOD, so Department of Defense, various US departments started coming out and giving their assessments on whether it was a lab leak or not. And they started saying it was. And again, if you put yourself in the position of the sort of waning superpower and the rising superpower, if you were the waning superpower, what would you say? Well, of course you'd say that it was the fault of the rising superpower. So just as China's got as much political interest to say that it was a wet market, the US has equal political interest in saying that it was a lab leak. And the problem is, as scientists, you're sort of stuck in the middle of that. It's pretty hard to sort of interpret what's going on. I got to say, I just find it hard to believe that for the species jump occurred. It was a big leap for me. Looking back on it, at the time, as I said, we weren't thinking about it. We know viruses go from animals to humans. We'll go with that and we'll move on.
The speed and the rate of which it took hold in the human population is the big question mark.
That's supportive of a lab leak theory, I think.
Yeah.
Looking back on it.
Going to stop you there, Dr. Nick, just for a second. We've got a message to deliver from our new episode sponsor, Blackmores. There's no shortage of opinions when it comes to health. Claims get louder, stories get shared, facts get blurred. Blackmores have over 90 years studying health, guided by evidence, science, and real expertise.
They focus on what's proven, what's understood, and what genuinely helps people live better.
Blackmores. More health,
more life.
So going to your position, you start in this role in March. The borders have just been closed. What are those weeks, March, April, like as you're at the heart? You guys are probably, the Prime Minister's calling on you more than anybody else in the country at that time.
Yeah.
What's that like?
Yeah, it's surreal, exhausting, and I don't think we'll repeat it. It was war. It was like what I would imagine a war to be. Just sort of relentless in terms of the rhythm And you just start the rhythm and you keep going. So the rhythm for the technical advisors is sort of daily meeting of the Australian Health Protection Principal Committee, and then the information's got to filter through to the Prime Minister. We've got to go and monitor the situation, do what we do in our portfolios. Mine was sort of being the link between hospitals and public health, and we had all sorts of policies that we were doing, shutting down elective surgery, all that kind of stuff that people will remember. You just got your head down and you did it. I felt as though it was the busiest period in my life. And I think when you look at people like Brendan Murphy and the chief health officers, Brett Sutton down here, Kerry Chant, like that sort of rhythm replicated across the whole of the senior echelons of the Australian government. And the chief health officers were the visible ones. What about the invisible ones, like the heads of the Department of Health, the heads of hospitals, all that kind of stuff? It was relentless.
And what was the primary objective during that phase? Like what was the number one thing everyone was working towards?
Well, it ended up being zero, which was never what we started with. 0 cases.
Why did that become an obsession?
I don't know, Rich. I think that, and this is a hard one because you don't want to turn around and not blaming the Australian community, but it's not appropriate for the Australian community either, or sections of it, to blame individuals within government for the choices. I think in Australia, you're kind of reflecting the will of the community in a way. And we got this idea that we're larrikins and that we sort of give everybody a fair go and that we're all pretty relaxed. I don't think that's what COVID showed us, mate. I think COVID showed us that when we want to get scared, we can get pretty scared. You've seen the articles when a kid gets meningococcal and dies. One case, and it's front page of the Herald Sun or Courier Mail or wherever, and suddenly there's big calls for meningococcal B vaccination. We don't do well with that sort of thing in this country. Like, we've got a very low risk tolerance. So when an article comes out on the 16th of March, 3 days before the international borders close, saying that we think there might be between 50 and 150,000 deaths, then I think, the country reacts as the country reacts, and we're all doing the same thing together. It's not the chief health officers and chief medical officers, they're not leading the community and the community is not leading them. We reflect each other and we move towards a situation where we've shut the borders, we know we can drive to zero. Zero's got to be a better situation than some, so we're going to stick with that.
Are you saying that if you could go back in time, what should our objective have been?
Well, we could have done what Sweden did, which was kind of tell your community, this is what we think you should do. By and large, they kind of complied, kind of didn't, I suppose. They had a very big spike in elderly deaths, and then it settled down for them. Now, if you look at what happened with us, we managed to keep the deaths very low for 2020. We get people vaccinated and then you get a massive spike in deaths in 2021 and 2022 when it goes through the nursing homes and, older people die. So it looks good for us in 2020, but by the time you get to end of 2022, it starts to look pretty similar to had we done what Sweden had done. The question then becomes, would the Australian community have tolerated that? I don't think they would have done. I don't think they would have copped it.
Do you think that's changed now?
I think enough of Australia would push back on it now that you wouldn't be able to implement those sort of things. But let me tell you, that is not the view of the public health establishment. I mean, people have listened to my commentary. I'm concerned about what mandates did. I've got a terrible story of a young girl who died from the AstraZeneca vaccine, which we should talk about in a minute. And I would not be an advocate for those sort of policies unless, remember, the virus changes every time. What happens if it's not 80-year-olds that are dying? What happens if it's 47-year-olds? Or worse, what happens if there's 1% mortality amongst 5-year-olds? So it does depend a little bit on the virus, Rich. I think if you had like-for-like coronavirus happened again next year, you couldn't do what we did with lockdowns and stuff. Too many punters would say no.
I don't think
probably
you'd get
be right.
any buy-in. You would not get, not in Victoria, you wouldn't get buy-in.
It'd be interesting to know what the percentage would be, but I reckon
obviously, like you say, if the disease changes and
the threat's different.
The threat is permeated over a much wider age group. And this is not, and you don't want to sound callous or harsh nobody wants an old person to die earlier than their natural lifespan or whatever, but nursing homes get pneumonia. There's outbreaks of bloody gastro. There's all sorts of stuff and it is the story of human life that when people are frail and weak, something will get you.
Yes.
In the end, but we did seem to be a bit blinkered.
Well, the only thing a nursing home resident wasn't allowed to die of was coronavirus. Like, think about that statement. That's what we got to. And the harshest stuff on me for social media wasn't necessarily people who were considered fringe anti-vaxxers, although that was pretty harsh to cop. It was people who actually wanted to lock down for longer. So when I started saying things like, we've locked down for too long, the mandates have gone on for too long, corporate mandates, I wrote in the Fin Review, shouldn't exist anymore. People were calling for my academic title to be removed and sticking on social media pictures of buses of healthy-looking old people saying I was killing Granny.
Yeah.
The public pressure
so emotive.
was emotive and extraordinary. And often the people who would do that, the sort of academic, some of the academic class, you'd peel that back a bit and often they'd lost someone. They'd lost an elderly relative, and that was, this was not science anymore. This was all gut feeling. What side of this fence are you sitting on?
Yeah, well, it would change your perspective, no doubt. I mean, human nature's that. I remember 2021, that was when I was going through some pretty harsh chemotherapy for when my lymphoma recurred. And obviously the virus was strong there. My immune system had been wiped out with the treatment. So a scary time in a way, but also I was torn because I was obviously not wanting to get any more sick than I was. But I too was getting very pissed off with being restricted and not being able to have that freedom of movement. And there were times where you just go, well, stuff it. Like I want to, I want to see somebody. I want to do something.
Well, you can't. You can't do it for lengthy periods. And I think the Victorian experience was astonishing. And I got to tell you that the first time the word draconian was used, it was by one of the most senior public health people in the world, a guy called Gabriel Leung. He's a Hong Kong professor. And in mid-January, he said, to control this virus, unprecedented or draconian measures need to be used. And then China started doing it, and everybody was watching them, and everybody else started doing it as well. None of this was in the playbook at all. Lockdown wasn't even a thing. It doesn't appear in any plans. So when we get back to the cabal core premise, what generates a conspiracy? Well, government action, people feeling out of control and things that they can't explain. No wonder conspiracy theories came up around COVID. I think you can explain it all with human behaviour and human psychology, but the conspiracy theories abound. And I just want to, we could go on for hours on this. So I just did want to mention this about the vaccine mandates because, we have lost a lot of people in Australia, and I'm talking about somewhere between 1% and 3%, maybe more, of people who have gone from vaccine skeptic but will still get their kids vaccinated to won't have a bar of it. Okay? And you can sit there and say it's RFK Jr., you can sit there and say that it's social media. That is all a symptom. The actual disease was what we forced people into who didn't necessarily want to do it, or even if they did want to do it, when they got a complication from it, one of which was fatal, they didn't get compensated for it. I was the guy up there, like it was literally me, who would get up there in front of the population with $20 million worth of advertising campaigns, say, get your first shot, get your second shot. That stupid ad with me in a coffee shop in Canberra saying, oh, I have a double shot. Like, anyway, worst ad ever.
Boom, boom.
It's free, simple. And the best way to protect ourselves and our community from COVID-19. Because remember, we're not safe until we're all safe.
Hey, yours is the two-shot.
To find out when it's your turn, visit australia.gov.au. Put that aside, I was also saying, don't worry, there's a government compensation scheme. Oh, I mean, what a bloody naive idiot I was, thinking that that was actually a thing. I think it's been proven, even in an ABC Radio National investigation, that it was utterly inadequate. And a young lady by the name of Katie Lees, who lost her life for the AstraZeneca vaccine, she told her parents, Ian and Penny, that she was going to get this vaccine because she wanted to help everybody else. Okay, so that's the good part of Australia, right? She gets the clot in the back of her head. It is not recognised by her primary care doctor. By the time she gets to the emergency department, it's too late. Her brain swells, she's on a ventilator and she's brain dead. Do you know how much money the Australian government paid her family?
No idea.
$70,000. That is all.
That's outrageous.
That is outrageous. And, you know, I can't believe that we think that like there had to be a bureaucrat at the end of that. And I hope they've seen Ian and Penny every time they've gone out into the media and thought, shit, I made a bad decision on that. Because if that's how much we're valuing one young life who was mandated to take the vaccine versus everything we did for older Australians, then our barometer got completely skewed by fear, Rich. And, you know, you can tell by the passion in my voice, I've had a bit to do with the Lees family. That's the example I come back to again and again. We got the balance wrong here. And when we do that, what do we expect?
Well, it's unstoppable force, isn't it? When the whole, like you said, the politicians, the health media, the health bureaucrats,
and the media,
and it becomes a snowball.
It was a massive snowball.
Yeah. I remember being in the media and listening to, and that is a tragic example there. And like, that whoever made that decision on $70,000. I mean, there's no amount of money really, but that's just
but you might as well.
It's an insult.
It's an insult.
Yeah. But then with the media, I can remember listening to broadcasters and things here and people who were lucky enough to maintain their jobs, as was I, you know, lecturing people and being the biggest public Karens about, you know, what you should do and you just have to sacrifice. Well, yeah, some people had to sacrifice a lot more than others. And it's easy to say that when you're on a $300,000 taxpayer-funded gig.
Yeah.
That, you know, and you might have the good intentions there, but that adds to the snowball thing and people hear that and then you become the ultimate busybody. What's they doing over there? What's this? What's that? And I just thought it was a really bad, bad thing. And I don't think that would happen again. I just think people would tune out to those messages there. But going back to vaccines, so we've got vaccines are still available now. What's your view on the efficacy of vaccines and the need? You know, is it a good idea to go and get one if you don't have any underlying problems?
Well, you know, and I got a huge amount of blowback for this. I announced on, I was asked by Ben Fordham on 2GB how many vaccines you had, and I'd had 3 and everybody said, oh, you were telling people to go out and get 4 or 5 or 6, and actually no. I firmly stopped telling people after 3 because our recommendations actually changed to, I think it was optional or good idea or something for, you know, vaccine 4, 5 or 6 or more. Remember, we're not talking about anyone with underlying conditions. We're just talking about someone with a normal, competent immune system. So I had 3 and I think because we're exposed to it now, there is no value in having more than that. The big problem, again, with the mandates and feeding again into the conspiracy was, you know, people lost their jobs in the emergency services in Victoria and in Queensland and probably the other jurisdictions because they wouldn't have a 4th or a 5th. Now, I only got my 3rd because pretty much we had to have it. We did. We had to have a 3rd to work in a hospital. But telling a police officer or a firey that they could lose their job because they didn't have a 4th dose, that was not based in any sort of scientific fact.
What's that mob mentality?
That was scientific mob mentality, yeah. I don't think the evidence was ever there personally, and this is something I have looked into in a fair bit of detail, to go for mandating 4th vaccines or beyond. Once you do that, you feed into the criticism that you hear, do you concede that the biggest source of misinformation in the pandemic was the government? There's 2 truths to that. One is that we advanced things we knew at the time and then things changed. I think you have to expect that as a community. Things are going to change. The other thing is we went too far on stuff that wasn't scientifically based, and then, you know, people like Malcolm Roberts do have an argument. And if you don't come and wear that as a government, which no one has done, the exception of yours truly, which we're doing now, and I've done on a couple of others. Some other people have done it, but not the big kahunas. Then, you know, that trust amongst, you know, say it's that, I don't know, 3, 4, 5%, 10%, you lose it, You lose it. We've spoken about it before on the Sovereign Citizens episode. We've spoken about trust in government. Nearly every episode of Conspiracy Cabal, you lose it and you're not going to get it back. And I think that's, the pandemic, if it's supercharged anything, it's supercharged a disconnect between, the faith that we have in government in Australia. It's not as bad as the US, but it's worse for sure.
Last question. What's your opinion on the likelihood of us having to confront another pandemic situation in the next 20 years?
Oh, high. Yeah, I think I'd have to concur with most of my scientific colleagues. I mean, when you think about it, Rich, basic probabilities and mathematics, just because something's a 1 in 100-year event, that actually just means that the probability every year is exactly the same. So there's an equal probability of what happened in 2020 happening this year as it is in 100 years. I reckon we could be in for another one. And actually that probability could increase if we don't, what are we supposed to do with gain of function research and stuff like that? There's certainly still nations in the world that are doing it. So we need to be prepared. And if we're going to prepare people, we've got to, in Australia in particular, we've got traditionally high levels of trust in our institutions. We've got a big battle now based on A, what we did during the pandemic, and B, the forces of social media working against us to try and to get us to a place where we're all going to be safe. But you can tell I'm not particularly optimistic about it.
All right. Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Dr. Nick. That was a Conspiracy Cabal special episode. Hope you enjoyed it. As always, send us your feedback, conspiracycabalpod@outlook.com.
Are you sure, mate? Maybe this is a comments off one. Just kidding.
Let's hear it.
No, let's hear it. We'll hear it.
We are not closed-minded here, and we're willing to take all sorts of feedback. Doesn't mean we agree with it, but we'll read it.
I'm Nick Coatsworth. You are Rich Baker. Ed Gooden's behind the glass, and thanks to the boys at Roland, as always, for their support with their studio.
Thanks for listening, guys. Come back next week. And as always, big thanks to our sponsor, Whole Life, an Australian pharmacy and wellness retailer with stores across the country and an easy-to-use online platform.
Where we both agree that good health is not a conspiracy. See you next week.